Many thanks. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Later today I'll be visiting Irvine to welcome plans by the pharmaceutical manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline to invest £100 million and create 100 new jobs across its Scottish operations in Irvine and Montrose. Now, this major investment reinforces Scotland's global reputation in life sciences. I also welcome the fact yesterday the Chancellor responded to John Swinney's proposal of the 7th of February that Irvine, along with Dundee and Nigg, be granted enhanced capital allowances as part of their status as enterprise areas. I'm sure we all remember the Chancellor generously acknowledging that that was a John Swinney proposal when he made his budget statement yesterday. However, I welcome the developments, as indeed the Chamber does. I look forward to announcing further investment in these areas in coming months. I'll be visiting Nigg tomorrow.
Joanne Lamont.
And I'm sure you'll enjoy your visit. And we always welcome this side glimmers of hope in terms of employment and investment in the interests of communities across Scotland. Presiding Officer, very few of us would agree with the approach taken by the Tories when it comes to our health service. So I was glad last month when the First Minister told us that Scotland is choosing a different path. Since then, we've found out a little more about the path taken by the First Minister, and it seems to have been a bit of a downhill gradient. Fewer nurses, decreasing standards in elderly care, cuts to social care budgets and patients going without blankets. And even the good statistics, as we found out yesterday, cannot be trusted. Before he rhymes off the stats he's no doubt already prepared, can I ask, why should we trust them?
First Minister.
Well, I think we should look at the record, particularly the public satisfaction with the health service in Scotland, which is at a record level, because the ultimate verdict in these matters is passed by the people and their confidence in their national health service, and that is in direct contrast to what's happening south of the border at the present moment, where many, many people are wondering whether they're going to have a national health service worthy of the name. So this government, this Health Secretary, this First Minister is totally committed to a national health service in Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
I think the point of the Scottish Parliament is that we can all aspire to better than what the Tories are offering us at Westminster. But we do expect your record to be better too, and I'll come to the people in a moment. Can we look, first of all, at what experts have been saying over the last few weeks? The Royal College of Nursing says there are not enough nurses to provide, quote, basic safe care. Audit Scotland is warning that councils and health boards are failing to ensure vital care services can be delivered in the future. The Centre for Public Policy in the Regions says that since 2006, Scotland has been lagging behind the increase in resources for England. Does the First Minister think they are all wrong as well?
First Minister.
Well, let's look at qualified nurses and midwives. And of course, there are now more qualified nurses and midwives in Scotland than there were in 2006. But let's look at it in comparison with the other countries in these islands. Per head of population in Scotland, per head of 1,000 population, we have 8 nurses and midwives, compared to 5.9 in England, 7.3 in Wales and 7.6 in Northern Ireland. I think that indicates the huge priority that this government, that this Parliament invests in our National Health Service in Scotland. Now, Joanne Lamont says, there's not much comparison comparing what we are doing in Scotland as a united Parliament, I hope, in terms of preserving a National Health Service and what's happening in England. But of course we could look at what's happening in Wales at the present moment, the sole area in these islands where the Labour Party is in government. Now, let me just paraphrase this by saying I have got great sympathy for the Welsh Government and the pressure they're under in terms of the Westminster Government. We're under exactly the same pressure. Yeah. But the Welsh Government decided not to protect the revenue budget of the National Health Service in real terms. It's due to fall by 8% in real terms between 2011 and 2014, unlike the decision made by this administration to protect the revenue budget of the National Health Service in real terms. So the contrast is not just between Scotland and the SNP and the Tories in Westminster. The contrast is between the SNP in Scotland and Labour in Wales. And I think the vast majority of people in Scotland will support the policy of this government to protect our National Health Service.
First of all, your budget has been cut in real terms by £319 million. Secondly, the substance of that answer was the RCN, the Nurses Union, is wrong. And to talk about Wales, we would like him to focus on his responsibilities as First Minister here. Because he talks about, on these benches, we would love very much to be in his position, I can assure you. Once again, for this government, the rhetoric doesn't fit with reality. So the First Minister doesn't accept the picture painted by the experts. What's he got to say to Helen Macbeth? Mrs Macbeth is 92 years old and was very seriously ill in the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Paisley. She spent her first night frozen because embarrassed staff were unable to get her a blanket. She had to rely on her daughter bringing one in for her the next day. Or Jack Barr, a great-grandfather who went into the RAH for a serious operation. 3 nights in hospital with only his beach towel to keep him warm. Does the First Minister realise it's not enough just to say you're protecting the NHS, you actually have to do it?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary has indicated that she is prepared to look into any case in the National Health Service where care doesn't meet the standards we expect. But this is a huge priority for this government and for this Parliament. And, I think there should be just a care from Jan Lamont. I mean, Jackie Bailey's already had to partially apologise, I think would be the words, about her scare story on shortage of blankets in the Greater Glasgow Health Board, which turned out to be totally untrue, as she's very, very well aware. But I know that the survey, which wasn't a Scottish survey, incidentally, which was published this week, indicated concern with nurses across the UK. There was no Scottish sample in the survey. However, there has been surveys by the RCN which were a Scottish sample. For example, there was one in April 2006 where 4,000 nurses were questioned in Scotland. And in that survey in 2006, in April, where Joanne Lamont was a government minister, if I remember, 2/3 of nurses said their workload prevented them providing a standard of care that they wanted. The current survey, across the September 11 survey, that had declined to 50% who were concerned. Now, I would like to have a situation where in a survey that no nurse was concerned about the pressure of work. But by any standards, that represents a substantial improvement to when Labour were in office to when the SNP were in office. And let's remember that Labour were in office when, due to their incompetence in financial management, they couldn't even spend the Scottish budget was allocated. We've been protecting the National Health Service against the most ferocious cuts for many generations. That's why we stand proudly on our record on Scotland's National Health Service.
It's one thing for the First Minister to repeat his version of his record. He has to confront the reality of what's happening in people's lives. It's also one thing to attack Jackie Bailey. It's something entirely different to attack those who are raising concerns about the National Health Service. Because we've established that the First Minister won't listen to me. We've established he won't listen to independent voices. Will he listen to people suffering from his mismanagement of the NHS? Mrs Macbeth and Mr Barr are sitting right there, in the public gallery. We've found at least 7 recent cases of patients going without blankets at the Royal Alexandra Hospital, and we pointed this out. The government denied it. George Adam, the MSP for Paisley, called on me to investigate my own health spokesperson, Jackie Bailey, for having the audacity to give voice to the complaints of her own constituents. And the reality is, if Mr Adam had just shelled out 45 pence for his local newspaper, the Paisley Daily Express, he would have seen our claims are true. And if the First Minister won't believe me, why doesn't he come and meet with Mr Barr and Mrs Macbeth in my office after this session and explain that we don't have a problem with the NHS? It's a figment of Jackie Bailey's imagination, because they'll tell him, as I am telling him, what the NHS is really like under the SNP. When is the First Minister going to stop the rhetoric and face up to the reality of his own responsibilities?
First Minister.
I refer Joanne Lamont to my last question.
Order, First Minister.
I said specifically that this Health Secretary, that Nicola Sturgeon, would investigate any case in the National Health Service where treatment fell below expectations, and will be delighted to meet the patients concerned or any other people who experience care which is less than what all of us would expect. That's what I said in my last answer. Nor did I criticise the nurses of Scotland. On the contrary, I pointed out that we would look to have a situation where nurses weren't concerned about numbers and standards of care. I merely pointed out that surveys show the standard of care, according to the nurses, is an improving situation from when Labour were in power. But we shouldn't be surprised about that, should we? Because let's remember in 2007, when this government came to office, the government then, which Joanne Lamont was a member of, said that the National Health Service would just have to cut its cloth. It wouldn't get any consequentials whatsoever. That was the policy of Jack McConnell. During the recent election campaign, Ian Gray, and he's sitting there, said in Newsnight Scotland on 8 September, we wouldn't ring-fence the health budget in Scotland. So the reality is, thanks to the election of this government in 2007, the NHS had more money spent in it. Thanks to the re-election of this government last year, the NHS has more money spent in it. Given what's happening in Wales, nobody can be in any doubt that the only party in Scotland committed to protecting the National Health Service and its real terms budget is this SNP government.
Joanne Lamont.
Whatever that was, it wasn't taking responsibility. Can I just point out to the First Minister, his Health Secretary wrote and said the problem with the towels, where they were there, the staff couldn't source them. He said it was an isolated incident. Unison members, as was reported in the Evening Times, have been complaining for 10 months that this was a serious issue. It's about time the Minister took responsibility, recognised he has the power and defend the NHS and respond to the concerns of constituents.
First Minister.
I think, as Joanne Lamont well knows, that the Health Board explicitly denied Jackie Bailey's claims as far as the recycled towels were concerned, and I don't think it's a very useful idea to return to something which our health spokesman should be genuinely embarrassed about. I've got great interest in making sure, as Nicola Sturgeon does, that every patient who experiences less than satisfactory care is not just met, but also these issues and complaints are dealt with. But I'm merely pointing out that it's beyond argument that if Labour had come to power in 2007 and continued in office, if they'd come to power last year, there'd be less resources spent on Scotland's National Health Service. The fact that Joanne Lamont was in government in 2007 and deputy leader last year indicates that she should hang her head in shame that she was prepared to under-resource Scotland's National Health Service.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
I have no plans in the near future, but I think Ruth Davidson has an appointment with the Prime Minister in the very near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Indeed. To ask the First Minister how much money has been diverted within the health budget in Scotland to fund free prescriptions for people like him, who are perfectly willing and able to pay.
First Minister.
Well, I'm not surprised in the slightest that Ruth Davidson doesn't want to talk about yesterday's budget, and particularly the effect on old people across Scotland. But let's remember the huge number of people, hundreds of thousands of people earning under £16,000 who were having to pay prescriptions in Scotland before they were rightfully abolished by this government. And I can tell Ruth Davidson that the idea that you should cut taxes for the richest members of the community at the expense of not providing medicines that people can afford, it will be deeply unpopular in Scotland. Yes. But deep unpopularity is nothing new for the Scottish Conservative Party.
Ruth Davidson.
I'm happy to talk about the 73,000 people taken out of tax altogether, the 2.1 million people who see their tax rate rise, the biggest rise in pensions which will benefit pensioners right across the country. But that's not the numbers I asked from this First Minister, and I'll give him the numbers that I asked for. The Government's own figure is that £130 million will be spent funding free prescriptions by the end of this month alone. That's £130 million to buy votes at the last election. But as we heard last week, there's no money for a cancer drug fund. £130 million for prescriptions, but the RCN tells us this week less money for nurses in the front lines, and despite the protestations from the First Minister today, the lowest number of nurses in Scotland for 6 years. £130 million bill for free prescriptions, and yesterday a health board found fiddling the figures because it's missing its targets, and today the British Medical Association saying that even visiting your family doctor means getting treated in substandard conditions and in crumbling buildings. Government is all about choices. Will the First Minister now admit that there are far graver needs in Scotland's health service than his choice for a free prescription giveaway?
First Minister.
Well, I think pressure on the National Health Service and other budgets in Scotland might be something to do with the cutbacks taking place from the Westminster Government. I'm surprised even Ruth Davison would want to defend a situation testified by pharmacists across the country where patients had to choose which medicines they took because of prescription charges and the impost on people with repeat and regular prescriptions. But I don't think mentioning the British Medical Association is a particularly good idea for Ruth Davison. As I understand it, they're thinking of standing candidates against the Conservative Party in England, so disgusted are they by the performance of the Tory government on the health service. But I am delighted that Ruth Davison wants to talk about yesterday's budget, because David Mundell on television last night was unable to tell us how many people in Scotland would benefit from the cut in top-rate tax, and unable to tell us how many pensioners would suffer from the pensioners being punished in the budget. Well, I can tell Ruth Davison 15,000 top taxpayers in Scotland will benefit, and 327,000 current pensioners and 500,000 future pensioners will be punished by the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. I actually believe, incidentally, that these 15,000 top-rate taxpayers in Scotland would not have wanted their bonus to be at the expense of 500,000 pensioners in Scotland. And therein lies the difference between the politics of the SNP and the politics of Scotland and the politics of the Conservative Party. Punish the pensioners and keep the rich happy is the policy of the Tory Party. Devoted to all of the people of Scotland is the policy of this government.
Since the publication of the PricewaterhouseCoopers report into waiting time scandal at NHS Lothian, I have been approached by a number of patients and staff who have raised further concerns about both the management culture, governance and practices at NHS Lothian. Will the First Minister now instruct a full, comprehensive and independent review of the whole of NHS Lothian's activities?
First Minister.
Well, the statement from the Health Secretary yesterday dealt with that exact point in terms of taking forward this issue. I don't think anyone listening to that statement or participating in it yesterday could be under any other impression how seriously the Health Secretary takes the situation and how determined she is to make sure it's sorted out, as it is being sorted out. But I don't think this particular issue should deflect from the reality that more people in Scotland right now are satisfied with the National Health Service than ever before. And secondly, we owe an enormous amount across the health service of Scotland to the dedication and work of the health professionals, the nurses and all of the staff in our National Health Service.
Adam Ingram.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister what assurances he can provide to the 60-strong workforce at Solway Precast in Bar Hill facing closure, and the workforce at the nearby Nestle plant in Girvan facing significant redundancies following announcements from both companies over the last week? Will the Scottish Government work effectively to mitigate the impact on them, their families and the local community?
First Minister.
I share the member's concern concerning the recent developments at Solway Precast and Nestle and the impact this will have on employees affected, their families and the communities in South Ayrshire. I can confirm we will do everything we can to help. The local Ayrshire PACE team is making contact today to offer support to the employees in Nestle who will be affected by redundancy, who may be affected. I understand the company itself is committed to providing support to employees to find new jobs with local employees. employers. I hope that this reassures the member that we are doing and will do everything we can to provide support to minimise the time that those individuals are affected by redundancy and to minimise the impact on the local economy.
Question number 3, John Wilson.
To ask the First Minister what the impact will be of the UK budget on the people of Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, the Chancellor's budget is a missed opportunity to get the economy moving to deliver greater fairness. The budget allocated next to no meaningful new resources or contained any new initiatives to support growth in the economy. Indeed, the OBR itself confirms this in its supporting documents. I quote, the Office of Budget Responsibility, quote, the Government has announced policy measures that have had a limited effect on our economic forecast. And I hear from the Tory benches the comment on the oil industry. If the summit of Tory ambition is to undo part of the damage that they did in last year's budget, although no doubt they'll blame the Liberal Democrats for last year, just as the Liberal Democrats will blame the Tories for the effect on the pensioners this year. If that is the summit of the Tory party's ambition, then it's hardly surprising they've been reduced to their current poor position in Scottish politics.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the First Minister for his reply. And does he share my concern that George Osborne's budget will do more to benefit millionaires than the people of Scotland? The First Minister will also be aware that the Chancellor's proposal to freeze age-related tax allowances for pensioners will, according to the HMRC's own figures, leave average pensioners £83 worse off in 2013-14. Can the First Minister indicate what the impact on pensioners in Scotland will be by this disgraceful raid on pensioners' tax allowances?
First Minister.
Well, yes, I can. And unlike David Mundell, actually know the numbers for this. The 330,000 current pensioners who will be affected by the decision. John Wilson rightly indicates the effect in this year, but by 2016-17 the effect will be £220 more in income tax, and the number of pensioners affected will have risen to 500,000. Can I say to the member, that's 500,000 pensioners that his party has punished, and many of them, no doubt, will be watching this debate and this programme. Finally, can I say to the Conservative Party that the pensioners' allowance was first introduced by Winston Churchill when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And basically we've got to this stage where the Conservative Party, in terms of their determination to pursue their own agenda, are prepared to punish millions of pensioners across the UK, 500,000 pensioners in Scotland, reverse the policies of Winston Churchill, and they wonder why next to nobody is voting for them.
Gavin Brown.
Just for clarity, Presiding Officer, I wonder if the First Minister welcomes the increase in personal tax allowances to over £9,200, and does he welcome the cutting of corporation tax to 24p next month and 22p in 2014, because the government press release and his own answers today have completely ignored those two very important measures for Scotland?
First Minister.
I and Mr Swinney yesterday, and I heard them, welcomed a number of specific measures in the budget. And yes, it's true, we welcome taking people out of taxation. We welcome more competitive areas of the economy. I wish the Chancellor had been prepared to acknowledge Mr Swinney's role in the capital allowances for the... Well, I do think if Mr Swinney, out of the goodness of his heart, makes a proposal on the 7th of February, and then I find out that it was all Danny Alexander's brilliant idea that's presented by the Liberal Democrats, then I think these things should be corrected. But the serious point is this. I don't believe that the relatively few number of people benefiting in Scotland from the reduction in the top rate of tax would have wanted to have that benefit at the expense of 500,000 pensioners in Scotland. I don't believe that. Clearly Gavin Brown does. That's the difference between our two parties, which is why we are here and why he's there.
Question number 4, Roderick Campbell.
To ask the First Minister what impact possible changes by the UK Government to regional pay awards would have in Scotland.
First Minister.
While Scottish ministers set pay policy for devolved bodies, it should be remembered that 32,000 public sector workers in Scotland are employed by UK departments and could be affected by this policy. This move could penalise public servants, damage public services, increasing regional pay disparities and resulting in spending cuts to pay for higher public spending elsewhere. This will do nothing to promote growth or fairness, and I think the Chancellor should think again about this half-baked plan.
Roderick Campbell.
I thank the First Minister for his response. Can he outline what the Scottish Government is doing to offer public sector workers under its control some level of security of pay, and will he expressly rule out following the approach of the Condemn Coalition?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government's policy has been consistent. We want to see a Scotland where a fair wage is a living wage, and where work pays. And I'm sure the member is aware that every employee of the Scottish Government, the National Health Service and our agencies are guaranteed from this year at least a living wage of £7.20 an hour. Almost two-thirds of the thousands who have benefited from this very policy, of course, have been women. Of course, the living wage will also be introduced to local government employees in all councils, and I hope it's a substantial number, which are led by the SNP after May's election.
John Park.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And obviously there's a majority of people here in the Parliament who are against the Government's policy on pay and on pensions at UK level. But can I ask the First Minister about his own pension in particular? And given that he was part of the previous scheme where he would have accrued benefits on the basis of his time in service, can I ask whether he has moved to the new scheme, which would obviously be much better for the public purse and perhaps not himself?
I'm quite certain that John Park needs to look up the record to find his question is based on a totally false premise.
Question number 6, Richard Simpson.
To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will reconsider its support for the continuation of the bonus points scheme for hospital doctors in the light of a reduction in NHS jobs and a general pay freeze in the public sector.
First Minister.
Well, there are obviously huge issues across the public sector at the present moment. How could they be otherwise with our budget being cut so substantially? However, it should be noted that staffing in NHS Scotland is higher than at the start of the previous Parliament. Between September 2006 and December 2011, overall NHS staff numbers are up by 3.3%, that's over 4,000, and medical and dental staffing numbers are up by 17%. The Cabinet Secretary for Health has led by example in our commitment to long-term reforms of local and national consultant bonus awards systems in Scotland. Richard Simpson will be aware that distinction awards and discretionary points have been frozen in Scotland since 2010-11, and the spend on distinction awards is now less than it was in 2007 when we came to office. So Jackie Baillie seems to be questioning the numbers, as she often does. It was £24.1 million in 2007, it's 20, and then it's come down progressively, £24.1 million in 2007 to £23.8 million in 2011.
Richard Simpson.
I'm not sure if I can thank the First Minister for that answer, because I'm talking about the bonus point scheme, not the distinction awards. At a time when his government has imposed a pay freeze on everyone in the NHS earning over £21,000, how can the First Minister justify to those on lower pay the fact that there were 201 new entrants to the hospital doctor bonus point scheme last year, receiving additional top-ups of between £3,200 and £25,632 over and above their salary? And how can he justify the fact that more than one-third of all the consultants already in the bonus scheme, not distinction awards, the bonus scheme, were given increases at an additional cost to the health service of £2.6 million? And this despite the promises by the Cabinet Secretary to freeze the system to new entrants and to cease increases for other people.
First Minister.
I know exactly the difference, and I'm sure Richard Simpson will be the first to acknowledge that the discretionary point scheme, the local award scheme that he's talking about, was something in place throughout Labour's time in office. The NHS Board believe that they are contractually obliged to continue with the current scheme, contractually obliged, until a new system can be negotiated. That is the belief of the NHS boards. And it's not good enough, incidentally, for Richard Simpson to just sweep away the distinction award scheme, because that is a scheme in which there is not a contractual entitlement. And so it has been possible for the Cabinet Secretary for Health to freeze the value and number of awards. Between 2009-10 and 2011-12, there were 84 less consultants holding awards, that's minus 15%, and over the same time frame, there's been a saving of £4.1 million. So, in terms of Richard Simpson's question, if you don't want to thank me for the answer, and I can understand why he doesn't want me to thank for the answer, because it's an inconvenient reminder that he's complaining about something that Labour not just established the system, but did nothing about in their entire time of office. And it also allows me to draw attention to the area which is not contractually bound, where the Health Secretary has taken decisive action.
Question number 6, John Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether he considers that separation from the rest of the United Kingdom could be negotiated within a year of an independence referendum.
First Minister.
Well, if John Lamont was so confident about his position, then he wouldn't feel the need to describe the process of independence and self-determination and self-respect in such pejorative terms. Can I refer him to paragraphs 4.1 and 4.5, Your Scotland, Your Referendum consultation paper, which has now received 7,000 responses. Somewhat greater, I think, if I remember correctly, than the recent membership of the Scottish Conservative Party. You'll find in that document a timetable for what would happen after a vote for independence in the autumn of 2014. I'm sure he, in his heart, genuinely agrees that the proposed timetable is proper, and following a yes vote in the referendum, the first election of an independent Scotland will take place in May 2016.
John Lamont.
Another non-answer from the First Minister this afternoon. However, given what he has apparently said about the possible timetable, can he enlighten us about what discussions the First Minister has had with each of Her Majesty's Government's reserve departments to consider what the implications for separation will be for Scotland?
First Minister.
Yeah, well, as we see that the pejorative term continues. What is it about independence that so frightens the Conservative Party that it dare not speak its name? Might it be because the number of independent countries in the world has increased from some 50 to almost 200 in the United Nations? How many of these independent countries in the United Nations describe themselves as separate countries or engaged in the process of separation? I look forward to the United States of America celebrating their Separation Day on the 4th of July. The greatest ally of the Conservative Party.
Mr Johnston!
I know that many countries have become independent and have done so in very similar timescale. For example, the Czech Republic and Slovakia independence declaration took place on 17 July 1992. The countries became independent formally on the 1st of January 1993. The Westminster Government, I think every Prime Minister of the UK since Harold Wilson, has accepted the right of the people of Scotland to declare their independence, and after a yes vote, I'm sure that means they'll seek to conclude independence negotiations in a prompt and efficient manner. Finally, can I congratulate John Lamont on only falling by 22% in the Conservative Hussies popularity poll among its members. This is in contrast to Ruth Davison, who managed to fall by 77%. All the votes went to what we can only call the lost leader, Murdo Fraser, who's increased his popularity by 37%, but mind you, his opposition to minimum pricing. Maybe we should call him the lost leader, not the lost leader.
That ends First Minister's questions. We return at 2 p.m.